Act 1. The ship of dreams set sail. The dawn of the 20th century was an era of unprecedented technological advancement and boundless optimism. Nowhere was this spirit more evident than in the world of maritime travel. The great ocean liners were the undisputed kings of the seas, symbols of national pride and engineering prowess, ferrying passengers between continents in opulent style. In this fiercely competitive era, one name stood above all others: the White Star Line. Determined to outshine their rivals, the White Star Line embarked on an ambitious project to build a new class of superliners, vessels that would be the largest, the most luxurious, and most importantly, the safest ships ever conceived. The crown jewel of this endeavor was a ship that would capture the world's imagination like no other: the RMS Titanic. Construction of the Titanic began in 1909 in the bustling shipyards of Harland and Wolff in Belfast, Ireland. For 3 years, thousands of skilled workers toiled tirelessly, assembling over 3 million rivets to create this behemoth of the seas. At 882.5 feet long and displacing over 52,000 tons, the Titanic was truly a floating palace, a testament to human ingenuity. Its interiors were lavishly decorated, featuring grand staircases, opulent dining saloons, Turkish baths, swimming pools, and exquisitely appointed staterooms. The Titanic was not merely a mode of transportation. It was a destination in itself, a symbol of Edwardian elegance and technological triumph. The White Star Line spared no expense in promoting their magnificent vessel. They declared it practically unsinkable due to its advanced design, which included 16 watertight compartments. The theory was that even if several compartments were breached, the ship could still stay afloat. This claim of unsinkability, constantly echoed by the press, would later take on a tragically ironic significance. Finally, on April 10, 1912, after months of anticipation, the Titanic was ready for its maiden voyage from Southampton, England, to New York City. The atmosphere in the bustling port was electric. Thousands of well-wishers gathered to witness the departure of this marvel of engineering. On board, over 2,200 passengers and crew, a microcosm of Edwardian society, prepared for the transatlantic journey. Among them were some of the wealthiest and most famous people in the world. Industrialists like John Jacob Astor and Benjamin Guggenheim, prominent figures like Isidore and Ida Strauss, and countless immigrants seeking a new life in America, all brought together by this grand, ill-fated voyage. As the Titanic slipped its moorings and slowly made its way out of Southampton Harbor, it was a picture of majestic grace and power. Little did anyone on board know that just 4 days later, their practically unsinkable ship would meet a catastrophic end in the icy waters of the North Atlantic, a tragedy that would forever be etched in human history, raising profound questions about hubris, class, and the unpredictable power of nature. The maiden voyage of the Titanic was about to become its only voyage. Act 2. The Iceberg and the Unheeded Warnings. For the first 4 days of its maiden voyage, the Titanic lived up to its reputation as a ship of dreams. The weather was clear, the seas were calm, and the journey was remarkably smooth. Life on board was a spectacle of luxury and leisure. The first-class passengers enjoyed lavish multi-course meals, strolled along the spacious promenade deck, and relaxed in the opulent lounges. In the second and third classes, while the amenities were simpler, the atmosphere was one of excitement and hope. For everyone on board, it seemed to be a perfect, uneventful crossing. But as the ship steamed deeper into the cold waters of the North Atlantic, a hidden danger was lurking in the darkness ahead. On the night of Sunday, April 14th, 1912, the sea was unusually calm, almost like a sheet of glass. The sky was clear and moonless, filled with a brilliant canopy of stars. While this made for a beautiful evening, the lack of waves made it incredibly difficult to spot icebergs. Normally, lookouts could see the white surf breaking against the base of an iceberg from a great distance. On this flat, calm sea, an iceberg would be a dark, silent phantom, almost invisible until it was too late. Throughout that Sunday, the Titanic's two radio operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, had been receiving a series of ice warnings from other ships in the area. The messages were clear. A large field of icebergs lay directly in the Titanic's path. One of the most critical warnings came from a ship called the Mesaba, which reported much heavy pack ice and a great number of large icebergs. For reasons that are still debated, this crucial warning was never delivered to Captain Edward Smith or the bridge. The radio operators were employed by the Marconi Company, not the White Star Line, and a large part of their job was to transmit personal messages for the wealthy first-class passengers. On that night, they were overwhelmed with backlog of these private telegrams, and the Mesaba's ice warning was simply put aside. It was a fatal oversight. Later that evening, an even more direct warning came from a nearby ship, the SS Californian, which had stopped for the night after becoming trapped in a massive ice field. Its radio operator, Cyril Evans, sent a message to all ships in the area, including the Titanic, warning them of the danger. He began the message, "I say, old man, we are stopped and surrounded by ice." The Titanic's radio operator, Jack Phillips, exhausted and annoyed by the loud signal that interrupted the message he was sending, curtly replied, "Shut up! Shut up! I am busy." Evans, dejected, simply turned off his radio and went to bed. The final, most direct warning had been silenced. The Titanic, a ship whose captain and officers were unaware of the true extent of the danger ahead, steamed on at a near maximum speed of 22 knots, racing toward its date with destiny. At 11:40 p.m., in the ship's crow's nest, a lookout named Frederick Fleet peered into the darkness. Suddenly, he saw it, a dark mass directly in their path. It was an iceberg. He immediately rang the warning bell 3 times and telephoned the bridge, shouting the chilling words, "Iceberg, right ahead!" On the bridge, First Officer William Murdoch ordered an immediate, desperate maneuver. "Hard a starboard," he commanded, ordering the ship to be turned as far to the left as possible. He also ordered the engines to be put in reverse, but it was too late. The Titanic was too big, its speed too great, its turning circle too wide. For 37 agonizing seconds, the massive ship slowly began to turn, but not fast enough. With a sickening, grinding shudder that ran the length of the vessel, the underwater portion of the iceberg scraped along the starboard side of the ship, showering the forward deck with ice. The collision was not a violent head-on crash, but a long, fatal caress, a 300-foot gash that opened up the ship's supposedly watertight compartments to the freezing sea. Most passengers, tucked away in their beds, barely felt it. Some described it as a slight vibration, others as if a giant finger had been drawn along the side of the ship. No one could have imagined the mortal wound that had just been inflicted upon their unsinkable dream. Act 3, the sinking of the Unsinkable. Immediately after the collision, Captain Smith and the ship's architect, Thomas Andrews, conducted a rapid damage assessment. The truth was far worse than anyone could have imagined. The iceberg had not created a single long gash, as was once believed. Instead, it had buckled the ship's hull plates in a series of places, popping the rivets and allowing water to pour into the first 5 of the ship's 16 watertight compartments. Andrews, after a quick calculation, delivered the devastating verdict to Captain Smith. The ship was designed to stay afloat with 4 compartments breached, but not 5. The damage was fatal. The unsinkable Titanic was, in fact, sinking. Andrews gave the ship a grim prognosis. An hour and a half, possibly 2. At 12:05 a.m., just 25 minutes after the collision, Captain Smith ordered the lifeboats to be uncovered and the passengers to be mustered on deck. But on the ship of dreams, the nightmare was unfolding in a strange, surreal slow motion. There was no widespread panic, no blaring alarms. The ship's band was famously instructed to play cheerful music on the deck to keep the passengers calm. For many of the passengers, the idea that the Titanic was in any real danger was simply unbelievable. They had been told it was unsinkable. Many were reluctant to leave the warmth and perceived safety of the grand ship for a small, open lifeboat in the freezing, dark ocean. The evacuation was chaotic and tragically inefficient. The Titanic was equipped with 20 lifeboats, enough to carry approximately 1,178 people. This was more than was legally required at the time, but it was still only enough for about half of the 2,200 people on board. The crew, who had never had a proper lifeboat drill, struggled to manage the evacuation. In the initial confusion, many of the lifeboats were launched only partially full. The officers in charge enforced a maritime tradition of women and children first, but this was interpreted differently on opposite sides of the ship. One officer allowed men to board if there were no more women waiting. Another refused to let any men board at all, sending lifeboats away with empty seats. As the ship's bow sank deeper into the water, and its stern began to rise ominously out of the sea, the mood on the deck shifted from surreal calm to desperate panic. The class divisions that had been so rigid in life became even more stark in death. The first-class passengers, with their cabins on the upper decks, had easy access to the lifeboats. The third-class passengers, or steerage, were housed in the lower decks, trapped behind a maze of corridors and lock gates, their access to the boat deck deliberately restricted to maintain class separation. By the time many of them reached the deck, most of the lifeboats were already gone. At 2:05 a.m., the last lifeboat was launched. Over 1,500 people were still on board the sinking ship. As the Titanic's bow plunged beneath the waves, its stern rose almost vertically into the air, its giant propellers exposed against the starlit sky. The ship hung there for a moment, a towering, dark monument against the night. Then, with a deafening roar of groaning steel and crashing machinery, the immense stress on the hull caused the ship to break in two between the third and fourth funnels. The stern section settled back into the water for a moment, before it, too, filled with water and began its final, vertical plunge into the abyss. At 2:20 a.m. on April 15, 1912, just 2 hours and 40 minutes after hitting the iceberg, the RMS Titanic disappeared beneath the waves, taking with it more than 1,500 souls. Act 4. The aftermath in the freezing dark. As the Titanic vanished beneath the waves, it left behind a scene of unimaginable horror. The 706 people who had made it into the lifeboats could only watch in stunned silence. But for the 1,500 people left struggling in the freezing, 28-degree Fahrenheit water, the real nightmare had just begun. The night was filled with their desperate cries for help, a horrifying symphony of human agony that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. In the lifeboats, many were tormented by the sounds, but most of the boats were too far away, or their occupants too afraid of being swamped to row back and attempt a rescue. Only one lifeboat, commanded by 5th Officer Harold Lowe, went back. After transferring passengers between several boats to make room, he rowed back to the site of the sinking. But by then it was too late. The cries had mostly faded into an eerie silence. The freezing water had done its grim work. They managed to pull only 4 people from the water alive, one of whom died shortly after. The rest were silent, frozen ghosts, bobbing in the dark, their life belts keeping their bodies afloat in a vast, open grave. Help, however, was on its way. The Titanic's radio operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, had stayed at their posts until the very end, frantically sending out distress signals. Their calls had been picked up by a Cunard liner, the RMS Carpathia, about 58 miles away. The captain of the Carpathia, Arthur Rostron, a deeply religious and courageous man, immediately ordered his ship to turn around and race toward the Titanic's last known position at its maximum possible speed, a dangerous maneuver that required dodging the same icebergs that had sunk the Titanic. For nearly 4 hours, the Carpathia steamed through the night. At around 4 a.m., they arrived at the scene. They were greeted by a heartbreaking sight. A few scattered lifeboats, filled with frozen, traumatized survivors, surrounded by a vast field of icebergs. Over the next few hours, the crew of the Carpathia worked tirelessly to bring all 706 survivors on board. As the sun rose, it illuminated the full horror of the scene. The empty lifeboats, the bodies floating in the water, and the sheer, vast emptiness of the ocean where the world's greatest ship had been just a few hours earlier. The story of the rescue, however, is overshadowed by the controversy of another ship, the SS Californian. This ship, a British steamer, had been stopped in the ice field just a few miles away from the Titanic on the night of the disaster. Its crew saw the white distress rockets being fired by the sinking liner, but the ship's captain, Stanley Lord, for reasons that are still intensely debated, failed to act. He believed they were just company signals. The Californian's radio operator had already gone to bed, having been told to shut up by the Titanic's operator earlier that night. And so, the Californian remained stationary, its lights visible on the horizon to the dying passengers of the Titanic, a silent, unknowing witness to the tragedy. The ship that was close enough to save almost everyone saved no one. In the days that followed, as the Carpathia steamed towards New York with the survivors, the world was gripped by confusion and false hope. Initial, inaccurate news reports claimed that the Titanic was safe and being towed to shore. It wasn't until Carpathia arrived in New York on April 18th that the true, horrific scale of the disaster was confirmed. The world was plunged into mourning. Public inquiries were launched in both the United States and Great Britain, seeking to understand how such a catastrophe could have happened. Act 5, The Wreck and the Legacy. The public inquiries into the sinking of the Titanic were swift and comprehensive. They sought to answer two fundamental questions: what happened and who was to blame. The inquiries uncovered a shocking litany of failures. The ship had been traveling too fast through a known ice field. The lookouts did not have binoculars, which could have helped them spot the iceberg sooner. The number of lifeboats was tragically inadequate. The radio operators had failed to pass on critical ice warnings. And the nearby ship, the SS Californian, had failed to come to the rescue. The inquiries led to sweeping, permanent changes in maritime safety regulations. The International Ice Patrol was established to monitor icebergs in the North Atlantic. New laws were passed requiring that all ships carry enough lifeboats for every single person on board, and regulations were put in place to ensure that ship radios were manned 24 hours a day. The 1,500 people who died on the Titanic did not die in vain. Their sacrifice led to a new era of safety at sea that has undoubtedly saved countless lives in the century that followed. For 73 years, the Titanic itself lay undisturbed, its exact location a mystery, its hull a silent tomb in the crushing darkness 2.5 miles beneath the surface of the ocean. It was the Mount Everest of shipwrecks, a legendary prize for deep-sea explorers. Then, on September 1st, 1985, a joint French-American expedition, led by Dr. Robert Ballard, finally found it. Using a remote-controlled deep-sea vehicle, they captured the first haunting images of the great liner. The ship was upright, its bow buried deep in the mud, a ghostly, decaying monument. The discovery was a global event. It brought the story of the Titanic back to life for a new generation. The wreck of the Titanic is now a protected UNESCO World Heritage Site. It is a memorial, a grave, and a powerful, tangible link to the past. The story of the Titanic endures because it is more than just a story about a shipwreck. It is a cautionary tale about the dangers of human arrogance and our blind faith in technology. It is a story of heroism and cowardice, of the star-class divisions of a bygone era, and a profound human tragedy that unfolds when dreams collide with reality. The ship of dreams may have sunk, but its story, in all its tragedy and fascination, is unsinkable, a legend that will be told as long as there are stories to tell.